two of the great truth tellers of the 20th century and early 21st century were George Orwell and Howard Zinn. George Orwell said, "To telling the truth during a time of universal deceit is a revolutionary act." And the great historian Howard Zinn, author of A People's History of the United States, said that our problem is not civil disobedience, our problem is civil obedience. I want to go back a little bit in our history and the history of Europe and elsewhere to remind you of the great struggles that people have engaged in, like in upstate New York in 1848 when Elizabeth Cady Stanton and a handful of women organized themselves to demand more rights for women. And that was the beginning of a movement which changed the face of the United States. Going forward to the abolitionist movement with William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, many other great interventionists and activists. It's always been about a small group of people, as Margaret Mead, the great US anthropologist, reminds us. She said, "Never doubt that a small group of people dedicated and thoughtful can change the world. Indeed, it always has and it always will." So you think of people like Mahatma Gandhi in India, who, coming from very humble origins, was able to launch a freedom struggle that liberated the Indian subcontinent from colonial rule. Going fast forward to the 1920s and 1930s, it's very interesting what happened in Germany as the democracy of the Weimar Republic deteriorated and eventually morphed into the horrific regime of Nazi Germany. There was a very important poet at that time and a resistor. His name was Martin Niemöller. He's not a household name. You probably don't recognize his name, but you might recognize this poem that he wrote, which begins with, "First they came for." Does that ring a bell? It might. So he was, by the way, a U-boat officer in World War I. After the war ended, for whatever reasons, perhaps because of his experience as a part of the German Navy, he became a Lutheran minister and a pacifist, and also a resistor to Hitler's regime. And he wrote the poem, "First they came for the Jews and the Gypsies," and I wasn't a Jew or a Gypsy, so I didn't say anything. I've kind of changed that now to update it for our current needs here in the United States. So first they came for the gays and lesbians and LGBTQ community, and I didn't say anything because I wasn't part of that. Then they came for the Arabs and the Muslims, and well, I wasn't an Arab, I wasn't a Muslim, I didn't say anything, I didn't speak out. Then they came for the communists and the socialists, and well, I wasn't part of those groups, so I didn't say anything. Then they came for the trade union organizers, and again, I kept quiet because, you know, I wasn't part of that. And then they came for me, and there was no one left. So what price did Niemöller pay? Because he was a member of the German armed forces in World War I, he wasn't executed, but he landed into a concentration camp in 1937, and he remained in first Sachsenhausen and then in Dachau until 1945. Quite an amazing story. But then you have this remarkable couple of students at the University of Munich. This is at the height of the Nazi regime. Why am I telling you these stories about Germany? The enormous repression that people were under, and the presence of a police apparatus that would quickly arrest you and imprison you or kill you, took an enormous amount of courage. And I want you to think about that when you worry about, well, should I get involved, and you know, what will happen to me? Maybe I'll lose my job, or it'll be a black mark on my scholastic record. Not at all, because to be engaged in the struggle for justice is, as Senator Daniel Webster once said, the great work of humankind on earth is the struggle for justice. So I want to tell you about a brother and a sister at the University of Munich, Hans and Sophie Scholl. In fact, there's a feature film about Sophie Scholl with that name, about what they did. So these were a brother and sister, and they had a few allies. They started the White Rose resistance movement against the Nazi regime, and they printed up flyers, and they did what they could. They put them under the doors, they pasted them on bulletin boards and the like, and also they authored a very famous graffiti which said, "Every word that comes out of Hitler's mouth is a lie." So I ask you to think about the present context in the United States and just imagine another political leader whose name you could insert instead of Adolf Hitler, and you might be coming close to something that resonates very strongly. Now, what happened to the White Rose movement? What happened to these young students, the brother and sister Hans and Sophie? They were arrested by the Gestapo, and they were beheaded, literally. They were sentenced to death by the guillotine. A tremendous, the maximum price that people have paid throughout history. But the struggles continue. Talk about the United States and Rosa Parks, who refused to sit in the back of the bus in December of 1955, with a handful of allies that ignited the civil rights movement, which changed the face of the United States. I mean, I'm old enough to remember that this was, legally speaking, an apartheid country, where there was a total separation from drinking fountains to schools, to hotels, to restaurants, and this movement that started in Montgomery, Alabama, against all odds. What were the odds, as Howard Zinn has written about? The local government was certainly against the African Americans demanding their rights. The local sheriff, the local police. On a state level, everyone is against African American rights. And on the national level, we had presidents, both Democratic and Republican, not enforcing the 14th or 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. So this group started in Montgomery, Alabama, and then fortuitously, just at that moment, a young, charismatic, and brilliant orator moves from Atlanta to Montgomery to become a preacher. That was his first calling, Martin Luther King Jr. So he became kind of the voice of the civil rights movement, but there was all these other people that had done the work to allow for that movement to develop and to transform the country, to make it a little bit better. That struggle continues to be waged today when you see examples of voter fraud and more and more voter repression, particularly in states like Florida and Georgia and in other places. We know that that struggle for equality is not over. The struggle for racial equality, the struggle for income equality is not over. It's always about struggle. And so there was the great African-American abolitionist, Frederick Douglass, who said, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will." So it's all about struggle. And we don't win every struggle. Certainly, Hans and Sophie Scholl did not win that struggle in 1943 when they were beheaded. But there is dignity in resistance. We have our self-respect, and moving forward, we can bring others along with us on that road to justice and freedom and equality. Some of you may be not able to see the t-shirt I'm wearing. It says, and this is done by an activist friend of mine in Massachusetts, "The battlefield is between your ears. Put up a fight." I'm asking you to put up a fight. Resist. Rise up and resist.